Hello, scholars. Mr. Long here for World History 2. Today we're going to be talking about settling the Americas. This time period is going to cover from the 15th to the beginning of the 19th century. So let's go ahead and dive in. A little bit of a recap. The colonization and the settlement of the Americas is going to begin with the infamous Christopher Columbus, who stumbles across the Taino people in the modern day Caribbean, setting off a chain of events that's going to lead to the Spanish exploration and conquest, followed by the French and the English as well. For world history, a key event happening around this time is the exploration by Ferdinand Magellan, as he's circumnavigating or going around the world. He is going to be the first person to do so. Pretty remarkable feat. Unfortunately for Magellan, he is not going to survive the journey. And we'll take a look at a map on the next slide and talk a little bit more about what happened to Magellan. So here's your map of the world. Magellan sailing for Spain, hence the blue arrow. He's going to be leaving Spain over here in 1519. And over the next 2 years, he's going to be going all the way down around the southern coast of South Africa, over to the Pacific, through the Pacific. And in the Philippines, this island chain here, he is going to die. At that point, a fella named Del Cano is going to take over and complete the journey. So even though there's a different name here with Del Cano, that's the same journey from the Philippines that Magellan started back in 1519. And that journey, again, the first trip to circumnavigate or go all the way around the world. Other notable fellas that we need to be familiar with, we have Vasco da Gama, sailing for Portugal, 1497 to 1498, so about 20 years before Magellan starts his journey. Significant to note the dates on the map here. The Portuguese, in this yellow line, they're doing their exploration at the end of the 15th century, right before and during Columbus's trip in 1492. So when we look at the age of exploration, it's important to note that the Portuguese were the ones that really began pushing the boundaries of what Europeans knew as what was possible for sailing around the world, especially going around Africa. Now, while the Portuguese were going around at the end of the 15th century, they were settling colonies and building fortifications along Africa and doing their best to block other Europeans from doing the same thing. Hence, Spain gambling on Columbus's trip to the west to find a trade route to Asia. If Portugal wasn't already leading the pack there, Spain probably wouldn't have risked so much wealth in going west, and instead would have just gone around Africa like the Portuguese were doing. Today, we're going to be looking at a few other individuals. We're going to talk a little bit about Cortez. I know we talked about him in a previous lesson, but this is a really important guy for world history and what he was able to accomplish. We're also going to be looking at the French and English settlers. We're going to talk a little bit about what they're doing in North America, and you can see some of their names up on the map. You've got guys like Carter or Cartier, you have Cabot, and we're going to be looking at a little bit of how the French and the British are going to colonize North America and how they're going to do that differently. So recapping Cortez, Hernando Cortez, he's going to land in Mexico in 1519 seeking gold. He's all about getting that money. He's leading an army of conquistadors, which just means conquerors. About 500 Spaniards are going to square off with the Aztec Empire, an empire of about 5 million people. And if you look at those numbers, 500 conquistadors versus 5 million people, I'll forgive you for thinking that the Aztecs are going to whoop up on the Spanish. However, history is going to turn out a little differently, and we're going to talk about some of the factors that allow Hernando Cortez and the conquistadors to upset and defeat the mighty Aztec Empire. So the three main categories, or at least factors explaining why Cortez was able to defeat the Aztecs, are technology, politics, and biology. For technology, we're looking mainly at steel weapons. We're also looking at gunpowder. And we're also going to be looking at cavalry. So for the steel, the Spanish had access to steel armor and steel weapons. The Aztecs, on the other hand, are relying on layered fabric armor and stone weapons. Given the stone is mostly made out of lava glass, so it's still incredibly sharp, but not as resilient as steel weapons would be. So when it comes to hand-to-hand fighting, the Spanish are definitely going to have the advantage. As for gunpowder, the Spanish are bringing along some muskets. They also have some cannons. And while the ability to shoot someone from a distance, even with the less accurate weapons of the day, while that's going to give the Spanish an advantage, the biggest advantage lies in the psychological effect of gunpowder. And keep in mind, for the Aztecs, they had never heard a cannon go off. And so for the Spanish to be able to recreate the noise of a thunderstorm, almost like they're harnessing the power of the gods, this is going to play a psychological role in defeating the Aztecs. Finally, cavalry. We don't really think about riding horses as technology, but the Spanish have access to horses, which the Aztecs had never seen before. And the Aztecs also have the saddle and other technology that allows them to ride the horses. And again, think of the psychology, like I mentioned with the gunpowder. The Aztecs had never seen horses before or men riding horses, so it's almost something out of a mythological story. And again, it's getting in the head of the Aztecs while they're fighting this campaign. Politics. The Aztecs, for all of their triumphs, were a brutal people. And one of the reasons that they were so brutal were the human sacrifices that the Aztecs believed they needed to conduct every day so that the sun would continue to rise in the east, shine light on their crops so they could have food, and then set in the west. The Aztecs believed that if they did not make the appropriate sacrifices, the gods would not let the sun rise and all of humanity would starve. So where to get these human sacrifices? Most of the time, the Aztecs would raid nearby tribes and other civilizations, bring back prisoners of war, and then sacrifice them to appease the gods, which ultimately is not a really good way to make friends. So other tribes surrounding the Aztecs that were tired of being abused and sacrificed, but also wanted to get back at the Aztecs, are going to team up with the Spanish and help them win. Finally, biology. The biggest thing here is germs and diseases. When the Spanish arrive in the New World, they're going to be bringing pretty ordinary diseases as far as Europeans are concerned, smallpox and the like. Smallpox is going to ravage and destroy the lives of millions of Native Americans over the next couple hundred years. And it's really starting to begin at the end of the 15th century, shortly before the Spanish arrive, because even just Columbus coming is going to start bringing diseases over, and it's going to start spreading and making its way through Native Americans who, throughout the history of their civilizations, had never been exposed to smallpox and therefore have no immunity to it, no natural immunity to it. And the disease is going to wipe out millions of people and cripple their society as a whole. So between technology, politics, and biology, the Spanish are going to be able to take their 500-man task force and conquer a 5 million people strong empire, albeit it's not going to be 5 million people by the time diseases is done wiping them out. But this is still a remarkable upset for world history. Following the Aztec defeat to the Spanish, other Spaniard conquistadors are going to go out and conquer other Native American tribes. We have the Incas in Peru, made famous by Machu Picchu. They are going to be defeated by Pizarro. We also have the Maya in the Yucatan. They are going to be conquered by Alvarado in the mid-1500s. Coronado, another Spaniard, is going to push into the United States, but not really establish a powerful toehold. It's going to be the beginning of Spanish civilization in Central America, especially in the southern United States region, but it's not going to be as permanent as the Spanish conquests of the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Incans. The Spanish often intermarried with locals and created a group of people called mestizos. These were mixed Spanish and Native American populations. So the Spanish were very open about marrying and having children with locals. We're not going to see the same behavior with the English, who tended to detest such behavior, but the Spanish don't have the same issue with it. The Spanish are also going to be ruthless during their conquest of the Americas. They are there for gold and gold alone. A little bit of God thrown in, but mostly gold. They're going to be enslaving Native Americans to force them to work in the gold mines, to work them in sugar plantations, pretty much anywhere that they could take forced labor and turn it into gold coins and money. The Spanish are going to do, and again, causing the further deaths of millions of Native Americans over the next couple hundred years. Portugal. Portugal is, we already talked about them when it came to exploring around the African coast. They're also very eager to gain wealth from North America, or North, South, and Central America. They're going to begin settling around the east coast of South America in a place that we now call Brazil. And the Portuguese Empire is going to make money from the sugar plantations. Valuable cash crop. They're going to grow it just because Europeans want to buy it, and so they're going to make money from that. The Portuguese conquest of Eastern and South America is the reason that today, the country of Brazil, they speak Portuguese. They're one of only a few countries in North and South America who speak Portuguese, and it's because the Portuguese were the ones who colonized it. Makes sense. Most everywhere else in Central South America is Spanish because of the Spanish Empire. So let's shift on up to North America. The French, when they begin settling in North America, they are going to focus mostly in what is modern day Canada. So here's our map of North and Central America, New France. That's going to be where the French are settling. They're typically settling in the Great Lakes region and the rivers in the northeastern part of the continent, and they are going to be heavily invested in the lucrative fur trade, going out and trapping bear and beaver and muskrats and other animals and taking their pelts back to Europe, where wearing the furs is a sign of high class and fashion in European society. The French, for the most part, they tended to be pretty civil with the Native Americans, especially compared to the British and the Spanish. So the French were probably the nicest group to the Native Americans. The French, they were eager to trade, so they're going to be treating many Native American tribes as partners. They're not overambitious in establishing permanent colonies, so they're not fighting many wars against the Native Americans to claim land, the same way that we will see the British doing in the 13 colonies. So for the most part, the French were pretty cool with the French, or the French were pretty cool with the Native Americans. There you go. All right, for the English are mostly settling on the east coast of what is now the United States. For here in Virginia, key thing that we should recognize is the establishment of Jamestown. This is the first permanent English colony in the New World. And Jamestown was founded by colonists coming for economic reasons. They wanted to make money. The initial settlers weren't really looking to farm the land and stick around. They wanted to come in and find gold. If you've seen the Disney movie Pocahontas, think of them coming off the boats and singing about finding gold. Instead of finding gold, they are going to find the Native American crop of tobacco, and they're going to find that tobacco does very well in the New World, especially in Virginia. And so Jamestown is going to lean on tobacco as a cash crop to fund the colony, the same way the Portuguese colonies were using sugar and the Spanish were also using sugar, but also the gold mines of that region. In Massachusetts, in what becomes the region known as New England, we're going to have pilgrims coming over, for the most part, they're coming over for religious reasons, but also to find land that they can farm and have a life in. For the English, initially they were just coming to make money with Jamestown, but they soon realized that the money wasn't in gold and in robbing the Native Americans, but that the value was in the land itself, that they could farm it, that they could raise cattle, that they could cut down the trees for boats, and the natural resources of land is where the money was. So they're going to come to occupy the land and settle permanent colonies like Jamestown over here, first permanent English colony. And with the English trying to claim land as their own for England, this is going to spark conflict with the Native Americans, especially land coming from tobacco. Tobacco is going to be a big problem between the English and the Native Americans. Tobacco, some of you may know, some of you may not. Tobacco is very difficult on the soil. It's exhausting on the soil. It sucks up a lot of nutrients. And so if you grow tobacco in the same spot for several years, eventually the ground is just tired out. It's not going to be able to produce the same quantity and quality of the tobacco crop that it was doing in the very beginning. So these farmers would grow tobacco for a couple years in one farm, tire out the soil, and then they would move on to somewhere else and start again, which if that land's occupied by the Native Americans, that's going to lead to conflict with the Native Americans as the English and the Native Americans are exchanging musket fire over the land itself. So the English, because they were seeking to claim land for their own instead of just trading with the Native Americans, are going to be more violent against the Native Americans than the French were. Probably not as much as the Spanish, though, because the Spanish were doing a lot of shady stuff down in Central and South America. By the mid-18th century, so this is about 150 years of colonizing in North America, the French and the English are going to begin to fight a war. Here in the United States, we call this the French and Indian War, but the French and Indian War was actually a small part of what the rest of the world calls the 7 Years' War, or what I call World War Zero. And if you want to learn more about the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, I encourage you to dig into it or take my U.S. history class where we're going to spend some time talking about the French and Indian War. Not going to dive too much into the specifics of the war, because the important thing that you need to know here for World History 2 is that at the end of the war, the English and their allies, including some Native Americans, are going to defeat the French and their allies in North America. And by looking at the map on the screen, you should see that the French territory here in this goldenrod yellow color, where before the French and Indian War, they were all up in Canada and Louisiana in this territory, but after, where did they go? Well, they left, except for a little bit down here in the Caribbean. But for the most part, the French are kicked out of North America. And being that this is 1763, in about 12, 13 years, we're going to start diving into the American Revolution. And a big part of the causes of the American Revolution are going to come from the French and Indian War, which we'll get to into more detail at a later time. So consequences of settling North America. The Native American and European settlers fought each other almost constantly. There were a few breaks in there, and this isn't full-scale war like the French and Indian War. This is more raiding parties going out, burning a farm, causing some havoc, and then going back. And there were some full-blown wars, which we're not going to dive into here. But for the most part, just be familiar that the Native Americans and the Europeans, for the most part, did not get along. They both wanted different things, and cooperation, though possible and productive at times, did not dominate relations between the two groups during this period of colonization. The fighting itself was pretty merciless, often fueled by revenge. So, if you come over and you burn my neighbor's house, we're going to go out and burn your house, and we're going to go back and forth until everyone's dead and on fire. The English are going to control North America after they kick the French out, after the French and Indian War. which is why in the United States, at least historically, most Americans spoke English because of the English colonizing the area and then conquering the rest of the continent. The biggest consequence, especially for the Native Americans, are that the Native Americans are going to be decimated. They're going to have their population crushed by disease. We can trace this back to the Columbian Exchange and Christopher Columbus bringing European diseases over to the New World. And for example, we looked at the role diseases and smallpox played in helping the conquistadors conquer the Aztec Empire in modern-day Mexico. Quick example here from the textbook. One tribe is going to drop from 24,000 to less than 1,000 people over the course of about 15 years. That is a ridiculous mortality rate. And so these tribes are never going to be able to recover from this. It's absolutely devastating to their population and their society as a consequence. The death of the Native Americans is going to create a severe labor shortage for the European overlords. So whereas before, while there were still Native Americans alive on the continent, enough of them were able to be captured, enslaved, and used as slave labor in the gold mines and the sugar plantations and what have you, and other needs of the labor for the English colonists. But between diseases wiping out the Native American population, in addition to the Native Americans could quite easily run away and go hide with their tribe if they escaped the Europeans are going to start to look for a different labor source for their slave labor. And this is going to take us into the beginnings of the African slave trade in the New World. Not beginnings of slavery in general. Slavery has existed pretty much ever since one human could figure out they could force another human to do something that the first human didn't want to do. But for the chattel slavery, the huge industrial complex of slavery in the New World, this is the beginning of that, which we will get into on a later date. So that is a quick lesson on settling North America. If you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or drop me a line in Canvas, and we'll be talking about this in class next time I see you guys. Mr. Long, signing off. Over and out.